Good morning, everyone. We're just giving Zoom a minute or two to add everybody into the room, and then we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Good morning, everyone. We're just giving Zoom a moment or two to add everybody into the room, and then we'll get started. Thank you so much for your patience. Thanks, everyone. Just going to give a few more seconds for Zoom to add anybody else into the room, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, I think we will go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Gregory Phillips with Duke Communications. Protests against oppression have swept Iran since the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who was in police custody after allegedly wearing her government-mandated headscarf improperly. More people have died since the protests began. We have three Duke experts with us today to discuss the current moment in Iran, the factors driving the protests, and how the US is responding. With us today is Negar Motahedeh. She is a professor of gender, sexuality, and feminist studies in the Trinity College of Arts and Sciences at Duke. She has written books on the history of reform and revolution in Iran, most recently on the women's protests that took place just after the revolution in March 1979. Also joining us is Mohsen Kadivar. He is a research professor of Islamic studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke. He's the author of more than 30 books in Persian. He was imprisoned in Iran for his political activism and has been in exile from the country since 2007. And we have Bruce Jensen. He is a professor of public policy and political science at Duke, who served as senior advisor in the State Department from 2009 to 11, and is the author of several books, most recently on the use of economic sanctions. Good morning to you all. Professor Motahedeh, we'll start with you. The death of Mahsa Amini sparked these protests, and the hijab has become a symbol, but the protests are about more than just women's rights. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the factors driving this movement?
I mean, there's a 40-year sanction that has informed the political and economic conditions in Iran, alongside an isolationist government. So there are a lot of political and economic factors that are driving this movement. It's not just about veiling; it's about the freedom. It is really about freedom for all.
Absolutely, thank you. There's a lot more to dig into there, obviously, but Professor Kadivar, can you tell us a little bit about the frequency of protests in Iran over the decades and recent years, and why you think that's significant in this moment?
Sure. So I focus on protests in Iran since 2017 for more accuracy. Over the past 5 years, Iranians have increasingly taken to streets to protest over rising gas prices in November 2019, protest over low quality water in July 2021, protest over the removal of bread subsidies in May 2022, and no protest over the death of Mahsa Amini and the mandatory hair covering and also freedom in September 2022. This is really an increasing frequency, and I think that it shows that Iranians are outraged with grievances that won't soon go away.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Kadivar. And I certainly want to dig into that more too. But Professor Jensen, we'll turn to you now. From a US perspective, how is the Biden administration responding to the protests, and how might they factor into US policy towards Iran more generally?
Yeah, I think the Biden administration has a pretty full foreign policy agenda right now, particularly with the Russian war in Ukraine. And since it came to office, it has been trying to reestablish, renegotiate the 2015 agreement on nuclear nonproliferation and lifting of some sanctions. At the same time, as my colleague said, the pattern recently There's been one protest after another with much less time in between. But the main reference point for people in the Biden administration is 2009 and the so-called Green Revolution, the protest after the stolen presidential election. And I say that because many of the officials, Joe Biden was vice president then, some of his key people, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, were in prominent positions then. I actually was in the State Department then as well. And the Biden administration at the time fundamentally was trying to limit any U.S. endorsement or involvement, thinking that that would hurt the protests by, one of the pillars of this regime has been death to America, and also trying to keep its eye on its objective there. In some respects, it's a bit more active now. It's been lifting some of the controls on certain kinds of technology and internet technology, including some provided by Elon Musk, to try to help the communications. It's been supportive, but it's a balance to strike for an American president between being supportive of those seeking freedom and doing it in a way that doesn't compound their problems. It's a very tricky balance and not one you can absolutely predict where it's going to go as it develops.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Professor Jensen. Thank you, all three of our panelists, for those opening remarks. We're going to open it up to questions. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions in advance. You can also pose questions via the Q&A window at any time. If you'd like to ask a question in person, raise your hand in Zoom and we will unmute you when your turn comes around. If you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. Professor Motahedeh, I would like to come back to you for a moment. A lot of the focus internationally has been on the fact that these are women-led protests, as if this is somehow surprising in Iran. But there's a rich history of women leading protests in Iran that you've studied. Can you talk a little bit about how this latest protest fits into the history of women-led protests in Iran, how it's similar and maybe how it's different?
Well, I mean, I think most historians of the contemporary social movements in Iran go back to the Iranian Revolution of 1979 that toppled a modernizing monarch in favor of an unknown future government that ultimately became the Islamic Republic of Iran. In that fight against the monarch, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah, women and men were shoulder to shoulder in the revolutionary movement. And women were in fact in the forefront of the demands for freedom and a different form of democratic and egalitarian government in Iran at the time. So seeing women in revolt and the forefront of an uprising for essentially for freedom is not unknown in Iranian history. The same thing happened in 2009 in the crisis after the what was then thought to be the fraudulent election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
Sure, thank you. Professor Kadivar, kind of following up on that, you mentioned in your opening remarks that the increased frequency of protests leads you to think that the Iranian people are getting braver in terms of protests. What do you think is driving that, and where is that kind of increased bravery and more frequent protests coming from, do you think?
So we should keep in our mind that over 60% of Iranian population is young. It means that less than 30 years old. So this is a very young population. The demands of the youth, Iranian youth, is exactly the same as the demands of the other youth in the other countries. But Iranian governments are hardliners, and their demands, their goals are far from Iranian youth and Iranian population. Because of it, so these protesters, that most of them, almost all of them, are young people. So they experienced a lot. They were detained. They were imprisoned in these recent, protests. So by this rich experience, their family members are supporting them much more than before. And also their favorite national heroes, athletes and artists are in the same way. So they do not have nothing to leave. So they are so brave, they're in the street, they're chanting, and it's not, as my colleague mentioned, this is not only about the freedom for the women, it's freedom for the country. So in 2009, they chanted, "Where is my vote?" In this protest, their real chanting is, "Where is my life?" They need freedom of a style of life. This freedom of a style of life, this is far from what this mandatory style of life that the governments try to force to Iranians. One of the particulars is about hair covering of the women. So I think this is, as we mentioned, this is exactly about freedom.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Motahedeh, I'd like to come back to you for a moment. Professor Kadivar was just talking about artists, national heroes, showing support for the protests. You are a scholar of film in Iran, as well as many other things. Is that something that you have seen? Do you think that there is a cultural moment in art that is maybe fueling these protests or having any kind of an effect at all?
What I've seen in 2009, actually, during the 1979 women's protest, in 2009, and also today, what I see is that in the moment of revolutionary fervor, there is a real blossoming of expression, of creativity and expression in music, in graphic design, in the arts. So yes, there is a lot of montage films that are being circulated online, lots of new songs being written, both inside the country and outside of the country, in honor of I would say the martyrs and symbols of the revolutionary movement. I think this is one of the key characteristics of network social movements today is that instead of someone being in leadership, there is a symbolic reference to a person like Eric Garner, say, or Trayvon Martin, and in this case is Mahsa Amini. So there is usually this figure around whom the movement shapes its art, shapes its aesthetics.
Sure, thank you. And I'm glad you brought up social media in particular, because I wanted to ask you about that. Obviously, we've seen across the world in the last 15 years that social media helps fuel protest movements. And that's something, as we look at this movement, particularly in Iran, is something that obviously didn't exist, wasn't really around in 2009, didn't exist at all in 1979, and the protest going back to 1844 that you mentioned before. So how important do you think social media has been in this moment in Iran in influencing this protest and maybe growing it beyond where it might have been otherwise? Do you think it's actually been a game changer, or it's just one of many fuel rods in the protest itself?
I think it's inaccurate to say that social media did not exist in 1979 or 2009. I mean, the Iranian Revolution is characterized as the cassette tape revolution, and the undisputed leader of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 used cassette tapes to record his sermons and distribute it in Iran. And young men would carry boom boxes on their shoulders in the streets in Tehran and boom these sermons from the sidewalks for everyone to hear. So that was absolutely a form of social media. The sermons were also distributed in mosques and hand to hand, people to people, all around the country. And this fueled the Iranian Revolution at the time. The 2009 post-election crisis has been characterized by some as the Twitter revolution. It was truly the first time, as the scholar the internet scholar Clay Shirky says it was the first time that everyone was watching a revolution, and they were watching it on Twitter. Granted, governments and big businesses were not on social media at the time, but a lot of the information, at least for the West, was distributed on Twitter. Images were posted on Flickr at the time, and videos were circulated. Videos by eyewitnesses were circulated on YouTube. And it was in 2009 that CNN, for the first time, actually screened a YouTube video as a document of what was going on the ground in Iran. And it was unheard of at the time, but this was really truly the beginning of a networked social movement, I would say, or a way that social movements operated on social networks. And that moment really transformed how Facebook operated, how Google operated, how Twitter operated. Google started its beta program on translation at the time in order to translate, Persian tweets into English. Twitter made its hashtags clickable so that we could see who else was joining the conversation and what the conversation was about. Trending topics occurred at that time. Hashtag Iran election was the longest trending international hashtag for almost a year on Twitter. And it was really after that the hashtag moved to Instagram and Facebook. Also, the lightweight camera was around in 1979, and it was also a way to circulate images of Iran's revolutionary movement there. I think what's different now is that more people are tech savvy and are on social media. But I think the drawback now is that so many of the social media platforms are run by algorithms. And as many people know right now, Meta, which owns Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram, is limiting posts from Iran and about Iran content at the moment. And that is actually, no matter what the Biden administration is doing with regards to opening up communication networks, WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, and also Signal are filtered at the moment. So very little actually Iran content from Iran can make it to the West.
Absolutely. Thank you for that comprehensive overview. And I appreciate you calling me out on the fact that social media, of course, has existed for thousands of years, ever since humans have been able to communicate with one another. Professor Jensen, I'd like to come back to you. Obviously we do see, lots of images from Iran and albeit censored by the government, there are communications coming out, which kind of puts pressure, I guess, on the Biden government and the balancing act that it's trying to perform, as you say. Do you think, especially with your recent book on sanctions, as the US looks to see what it can or should do to influence what's happening in Iran, do you see sanctions potentially being brought to the table in the manner that they were used to force Iran to the table for a nuclear deal?
Yeah, I'll answer that in a second, Greg. Let me go back to just build on something my colleagues have been saying. I think this notion of youth and broad freedom is really important. Revolutions generally, not just the Iranian, the generation that makes a revolution kind of knows how bad it was, or they believe it was in the prior regime. And then even if the revolution has its issues, there still is this reference point about how bad it was before. These are probably the grandchildren of those that made the revolution. And so any stories about how terrible it was under the Shah, they just don't resonate. That's not anything peculiar for, Iranian culture. It's true, generationally across the board. And I think the frequency, the cumulative impact here is very significant. In terms of your question about sanctions, the reason that the sanctions work to help get the nuclear deal were a couple. One was that they were broadly supported, including by Russia and China and Europe, and that what you wanted in return was a policy change, a limited policy change. It's a significant issue, development of nuclear weapons, but a significant policy change. When Trump came into office, he pulled out of the nuclear deal. He ratcheted up the sanctions. He had even more economic impact, including, by the way, denial of medications and others to Iranians when COVID started to hit, even though he said it was about values, a pretty deep contradiction there about humanitarian aspects. And what was he after? He's after regime change, right? So no matter how much economic pain, whether it's Iran or any other country, countries don't say uncle to economic sanctions. So here I think that that no, there's not a sense of, if we squeeze more, that the government will change its policies. Frankly, it may be more likely to make it crack down on the protesters even more, to show that it can stand up to America. So this is not a case, there's too often we kind of use sanctions as sort of the Swiss Army knife of American foreign policy, when in doubt impose sanctions. And a lot of times they hurt the people you're trying to help.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Kadivar, I'd like to come back to you. Professor Jensen just mentioned the pre-1979 regime, and I know that the current government in Iran claims to be an Islamic government, but of course that doesn't mean that the protesters are kind of, obviously they're not anti-Islam. Can you talk a little bit about the government's claim to be an Islamic government and how you see that in the current moment?
It's a good question. I think we have different understanding of Islam among Iranians and their governments. Iranian governments are hardliners or fundamentalist Muslims, but majority of Iranians are not, and are against this interpretation of Islam or this practice of Islam. So most of Iranians, I can say, among the traditionalists or reformists, but no fundamentalists. Maybe only less than 10% of Iranians who are advocates of this regime could be called something like fundamentalists. So among Shiite authorities or Muslim authorities, Marja' Taqlid, so we have Ayatollah Montazeri that passed away in 2009, and he was the most important supporter of protests of 2009 Green Movement. He mentioned this historical statement: this regime is neither republic nor Islamic. So it means that, and I think this understanding we can find among most of these protesters. It means that they think that this protest is anti-theocracy, anti-weaponizing Islam, anti-governmental clergies or clergies, but I do not think this is anti-Islam. They practice Islam as they understand, but they support a democratic, secular regime for future of Iran. So I think that the demand of most of Iranians, majority of Iranians, I think more than 75% of Iranians today try to find a secular democratic regime for future of Iran. Because of it, we can say that this is the ruling of minority over majority. Majority of Iranians are against all of these understanding of Islam or weaponizing Islam, but the regime try to accuse the protesters, you are blasphemers, you are against Islam, the hijab or head covering is the essential of Islam, and you are against it. But they do not understand that this is the choice of the people to choose this style of life or another style of life. So I can say, according to Iranians, this regime is not Islamic at all. They call it so-called Islamic, not Islamic.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Kadivar. Professor Motahedeh, I'd like to come back to you. Professor Kadivar has mentioned a couple of times that the style of life demands the freedom to choose their style of life for Iranian protesters. Based on your understanding of the long history of protest in Iran, do you think that there are concessions that the Iranian government can make that would appease the protesters? Or do you think that the goal, whether or not it's achievable, is just wholesale regime change at this point?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that the demands that I've seen by women over the years has been the right to have a say over their lives and their bodies. How to dress, certainly, but also the right to divorce or not divorce, to have a say over a husband's second wife, a right to abortion, a right to live however they want. And I mean, I don't want to use rights discourse here, but there is an element of that in their demands.
Sure.
Like a desire to live as they want, and not just in the interior of their homes, but outside as well.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Jensen, as you've mentioned, the US has to play a balancing act here. It doesn't want to harm the Iranian people. But do you think that if it had its wethers, the goal for the US here would be regime change? Is that something the US would like to see, or are there concerns that would result in a destabilization in the region? What do you think that the US's preference is in this situation?
Well, you know, you're going to hear, I'm sure we're hearing already from members of Congress and elsewhere, a lot of chest thumping about this. A couple of points on that. One is there should be no assumption here on the part of Americans that what the Iranian protesters want is to copy the American system, right? We've made that mistake a lot over the years, and I think it's fair to say there's even more reason for countries not to want to copy it in the last 5-10 years. Countries find their own way about how they balance, you know, sense of community and individual rights, their own culture and history, you know, what freedom means. So, you know, this notion that, you know, they'd want to be like us, I think you hear a lot about that. And I think that it's overly self-regarding. And I mean, my goodness, in the 1950s, the leader of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, was called the Winston Churchill of Southeast Asia. And he proved to be a dictator himself. And Iraq was supposed to be, you know, the new leaders of Iraq were supposed to be making it into a democracy, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing. I think what the United States wants is a government that it can find some shared interest with, whether it's on proliferation or regional issues. Iran is not the only problem in the region, far from it. There are many Saudi policies that contribute to it. There are Israeli policies and the US policies. What form that takes, it's not this regime. It's made it pretty clear, particularly since the most recent election. But to the extent that there was a change of power that allowed for trying to find some shared interests, of which I really believe there are quite a few, that would be desirable. But, you know, I don't buy into, and I think some of the most sensible people in the Biden administration, there may be speeches and statements, but it's not about, you know, just finding a nice new democracy that's ready-made and something everything would be all right by then. So, you hear a lot of that, but I don't think that's where policy should be.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Kadivar, the obvious and oversimple question that a lot of people are asking is whether this will result in, the protest movement will result in regime change. Do you see that as a realistic possibility? Do you think, and if not, do you think any reforms are possible? Do you have any sense, based on your direct experience of the 1979 revolution and other protesters, to how this may play out?
This is an important question. I think this is the question of many Iranians and many protesters. The desire of Iranians, as my colleague mentioned, majority of Iranian is regime change. We can say in their chanting and their slogans. So death to Khamenei, death to the dictator, or they say more than this, death to the origin of the regime, death to the origin of the guardianship of the jurists. We do not want Islamic Republic several times. This chanting repeatedly, we can hear in more than 100 cities. This is more than the past protests, more than that. This is a new version of Iranian demands today. But when we ask ourselves, is it possible today in this protest, I think this is somehow idealistic. This protest is a step forward. We are closer to freedom of Iran and closer to a better future of Iran. But this regime, we should understand the reality of this regime. This is a revolutionary, young, authoritative, non-competitive electoral regime. I can explain very briefly about these details of this term that I mentioned. Since 2020, this is a non-competitive electoral authoritative regime in the name of Islam. It means that before that, at least we have two candidates in presidency election, one from reformist or moderate side and one from hardliner side. But since 2020, that the leader decided to have a non-competitive election. And this is the election that we have, and Ibrahim Raisi came to office. So it means that Iranian tried all the ways to reform their governments, and the governments blocked all the ways. So it means that there is no way for the people except coming to the street and protest and make demonstration, chanting because they wanted to use it to try to reform legally, to change the president, to change the parliament members. So I can say that the Iranian majority of Iranians do not have any representative in Iranian parliament. The president is not representative of majority of Iranians. What should they do? So this is when we understand they try to change the regime. But on the other hand, this is the regime use naked violence and weapon against people. According to Iranian constitution, Article 27, it's the civil rights of Iranian to have an armed demonstration. But in 43 years, we didn't have even one opposition demonstration in Iran. They cannot do it. The governments did not allow them to do this. So what should they do? On the other side, so this regime is supported strongly by Russia and China. So this is their allies in the region. And this regime also is among the most powerful regime in the region. So because of it, changing it is not so easy, but I think I'm so optimistic that in future of Iran, maybe our kids, the next generation, or maybe in next future, we can see that a regime that Iranian loved it, and this is the representative of Iranians and not among the hardliners, will be in the power. But in the recent, I think, protest, I think it's so early.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Motahedeh, the response that we're seeing from the Iranian regime now is just to crack down. Again, what is the history of protests, especially women-led protests in Iran? Tell us about the effect of these crackdowns. Does it just mean that even if they're successful in quelling protests, the protests are likely to come back sooner? You know, because you can't rid a country of that kind of sentiment. Like, what tends to happen? Have crackdowns historically been successful, or do they ultimately just allow the discontent to ferment and result in a larger explosion down the line?
Well, I was just thinking about when Khomeini came back to Iran from his exile in France in February of 1979. Within a couple of weeks of his return, he made a pronouncement that women in governmental, like in the ministries, should wear a hijab, wear a veil. And what happened then was that the next day, after this was published in the newspaper, women went to work and were turned back and were told that they needed to go home and wear a headscarf or wear a hijab to come to work. So as they were each walking home to get their headscarves in order to come back to work, they met each other, but they also were met by men who were in support of this idea of women wearing the hijab and were harassed by them on the street. This was what fueled a 10-day women's protest in Iran in 1979, in March, early March of 1979. So I do think that any act of power leads to multiple acts of counterpower. On the other hand, I also want to mention, as Professor Kadivar also said, that what we're dealing with is essentially a networked social movement. I mean, the majority of people are protesting online. And networked social movements by character are about raising awareness and changing people's minds. They are not about actual policy changes. They don't end in that necessarily. They don't end in changes in the law, but they are demands for justice and demands for people's attention.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Jensen, I'd like to zoom out and talk for a moment about an incident outside of Iran yesterday. The US shot down an Iranian drone that US officials said was headed towards American forces in Iraq. And on the same day, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard killed several people in northern Iraq in an attack on Kurdish separatists. Is it a mistake to kind of draw any connections between how Iran might be acting in the region based on its the government's domestic troubles at home, or could one be influencing the other?
Yeah, it's not a mistake to draw those connections as long as one does it as, in pencil, not pen, right? It's really hard to know. I mean, one can see a connection, the woman who was arrested and killed in custody was Kurdish, and some of these attacks have been at Kurdish areas of Iraq, claimed to be groups that have been, said to be terrorists according to the Iranian government and others. And it may also be a couple things. It's really when you're getting this, even if you're in the intelligence community, getting so-called classified intelligence, you really gotta, not seize a conclusion there. And same thing's happening, by the way. I've been involved with, sort of the sanctions against Russia and the natural gas squeezing of Europe. And there was a pipeline explosion the other day. And first people said Russia did it, and now they're saying, wait a second, we don't, we really need to know who did it. In order to do it. And so I think here it could be an effort by the regime to play that death to America card, to get into external confrontation with the United States and say, let's rally around our, rally around our flag. For the reasons my colleagues are saying, I don't think that offsets what has people protesting. It could have its own dynamic. So it can impact, and we need to see how it develops, but I don't think it'll stay isolated, but I'm really wary about drawing any firm conclusions about what was done, who did it, and why just yet.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Kadivar, we've had a question come in I'd like to pose to you, and someone's asked if you think there are lessons to be learned from the failed Arab Spring protests in Iran, whether there are lessons to be learned there. This is fairly recent in the region, and now we have this other protest going on. Do you think there are lessons can be learned? Do you think that there are maybe lessons that this protest movement has learned from the Arab Spring?
So this was a connection between Iran's protest in 2009 and Arab Spring. I remember the last statement from Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi that are in house arrest for about 12 years. So they wanted to express their solidarity for Arab protesters in Arab Spring. And there exactly I remember at that time in 2010, their house arresting was started by this solidarity. The regime did not allow them to do this. Yes, Iranian on that time in Green Movement, I think they taught something to their Arab counterparts. And after that, we can learn a lot from those countries. Unfortunately, in most of the Arab countries, it was not succeeded, except in Tunis. And also recently, we found that also in Tunis, so it was the end of, somehow the end of democracy. And also the new governments by military coup came to power. I think we should learn from each other. And maybe now the Arabs should learn something from these Iranian protesters and these Iranian movements that we should go forward. The only thing that I can say that we learned from Tunisia, so Al-Nahda, that is the Islamists in Tunisia, so they tolerated and they accepted the secular, I think, figures came to power and they supported them. I think in future of Iran, we have the same issue. It means that also we have some Islamists, moderate Islamists in Iran, but many seculars also in Iran. So they will be get together, and the future of Iran will be by the help of these two camps together. It means not only Islamists, I'm sure that also majority of Iranians are Muslims, but the regime of future of Iran will be secular. It's accepted, and it will learn by especially from Tunisia. Most of Iranians learned from Tunisia. We have another experience in Turkey. We have other experiences in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in other Muslim majority countries. We learned something from Afghanistan. So in the neighbor of Iran. So the hardliners and the Muslim fundamentalists are in power. This is the best, I think, lesson for Iranians. I think Iranian understand. They call it Talibani Islam. It's another name for hardliners in Iran. They understand there is no difference between Muslim fundamentalists in Afghanistan and Muslim fundamentalists in Iranian in power in Iran. So this means that no, this village, this global village is so small and so short, and we can learn from each other.
Thank you, Professor Kadivar. Professor Motahedeh, I'd like to come back to you. The tone of Professor Kadivar's last answer was optimistic, and he mentioned earlier that very word. Do you share that optimism for the future of Iran at this point?
I certainly do, and I don't know how this is going to play out.
Absolutely. Well, I guess, if you did, that would have been my first question out of the box. Professor Jensen, I'd like to come back to you. One of the things that Professor Kadivar also highlighted is that the Iranian regime is supported by Russia and China. Russia obviously has problems of its own at this point, but how do you think that support plays into how the international community responds to what's happening in Iran? Does that loom large?
Yeah, let me again go back to, I think my colleagues just both made really great points, and going back to the Arab Spring, and I also was in the State Department when this happened, there was this sense, oh my goodness, Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Syria, the spread of protests in an incredibly short period of time. But then you see, when you play it out, as was just said, regimes crack down. And this regime in Iran, killed, a significant number of people in the last round of protests. Even if there's change, as in Tunisia, which was seen as, the great example of change that could lead to, a reformist government, and is now, working its way back to another kind of dictatorship. And so there's so many aspects to this that even if the regime in Iran were to fall, there'd be many positive aspects to that, but it has to play out over time. On your question about Russia and China, look, Russia is looking for every opportunity now, to find allies. It's actually relying on Iran for drones. Here's Russia, the second largest military power in the world. but because it's had been so unsuccessful in Ukraine, relying on Iran for drones. So it probably is prepared to do almost anything in return for the Iranian regime, in exchange for its support there. China's game is a little more complicated, I think. China has been developing relationships all over the Middle East, not just economic, but strategic, including with Saudi Arabia, with Israel, with the United Arab Emirates. And so, and many of these countries, let's just say the UAE and the Saudis, even leaving the Israelis out of it, have their issues with the Iranian regime. So how China plays this can't be simply a blank check for the Iranian regime. I think the Russians may do that, but China has a lot of its stakes with other countries in the region, even leaving out of the equation their relationship with the United States and Europe.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Kadivar, I'd like to come back to you. We've had another question come in, and it asks how the lack of a unified leadership in Iran, in the protest movement, affects how successful it may be in bringing about meaningful, sustained reform.
So, in 2009, the protest had a leadership, Mir Hossein Mousavi. He's in house arrest. And also it was a spiritual leader, Ayatollah Montazeri, that passed away. And today, this protest does not have any head. It was said it's better. Why? Because if it had a head and in the country, it was detained, imprisoned, house arrest, or also maybe killed. So today we have many heads. We can say this is what I saw in the social networks. All of us are the heads, the protesters said, are the heads of this protest. So it means that after ruining and destroying all political independent parties in Iran, we do not have any independent party today. All of them are banned, and their directors or their heads are in detained or in imprisonment or in house arrest and so on. One of these, for example, the reformist leaders, Mustafa Tajzadeh, now he's in the prison, and with a lot of followers. The other one, Madani, Saeed Madani, is in the house arrest. He was the scholar of social affairs. So it means that the regime is so careful to remove all the heads or also potential heads. What we can say here, I think that we could not see in the past protest, it's about the reporters, journalists, photographers. So all of these are in the detained or in the prison, in the jail. It means that now we have more protesters, more diversity among the people. But yes, I agree with you. In future, these protests and also this opposition need more heads in Iran, not out of Iran. So this is something that this is agreement or consensus among the protesters that the head should be in Iran. So because of it, these protesters are so careful. One of their slogans, one of their chanting is, death to the oppressor, regardless, this is the religious leader, supreme leader, or this is the king. It means they are against royal monarchy and they are against royal in the name of Islam or royal monarchy in the name of Islam. So this is, I think that if we want to have a successful protest for future, it needs to create their heads in Iran.
Thank you. Professor Motahedeh, I'm wondering if you can tell us how your research speaks to this and the history of reform and regime change and protest in Iran, how important centralized leadership of a protest movement has been, and whether you think it's as crucial as Professor Kadivar just outlined.
Well, I was just thinking about what Professor Kadivar said, and so many of the slogans that have been spoken in our conversation today are about death to this and death to that. I think that the primary slogan that I'm seeing circulating amongst the protesters is woman, life, freedom. These are the three words that are the standard bearers of the protests today. And I just want to underscore that, at least in Shiism, the idea of the political leadership of theocrats was quite unheard of until Khomeini took power in 1979. And the way that he assuaged the theocracy in Iran, the mullahs and religious leaders, in order to take power, was to give them the lives and the choice of women. So the lives and bodies of women. Women's right to a woman's right to divorce, the woman's right to deal with her body the way she wanted to abortion, to marriage, to have a say in marriage, etc. These were all things that were decided within a secular government, a secular legal system in Iran under the Shah. And Khomeini's immediate action was to fire female jurists from the secular system, and to give the legal decisions on marriage, divorce, abortion, the right to have a say about the second wife, etc., to male jurists. So there is a sense in which Iran's standing as a nation, as an Islamic nation, as a political unit, is hinged on the lives and bodies of women. And this needs to be underscored. And this, I think, is the point of this movement and the slogans that they're using.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much. We're going to be wrapping up here shortly, but I want to come back to each panelist for a final question. Professor Jensen, I'd like to start with you. One of the questions that we had come through is that what concerns are there about a power vacuum if the current regime were to be sidelined? Do you think that's something that concerns the US and the international community? Like, how high is that on the level of concerns as they watch this unfold?
It always does. And it goes back to the discussion a little bit earlier that, you know, a regime falling is step one in a process that has any number of steps to it. You know, the notion that you only have two, one regime falls and a much better regime for its own people comes into power, rarely happens. I don't think that I think that affects, I mean, for example, I think the United States too often, you know, picks someone in an opposition that's going to be our guy, our woman, our people. And more often than not, that's a big mistake. So there's not going to be a smooth transition. If there is a transition, it's not going to be smooth. But I think the international community generally, and here I think it's the United States, Europe, I think many others want to see it happen in ways that, you know, a transition would be a positive thing away from this terrible regime, and then do what they can to try to make it as as unbumpy as possible, with the interests of the Iranian people foremost in mind.
Absolutely, thank you, Professor Kadivar. I'd like to come back to your optimism, which I'm hoping is giving hope to people that see this. And I'm wondering, through the various things you've outlined, realistically, what are some things that you would hope to see and think you might reasonably expect to see in the coming weeks? You know, right now we're seeing protests, we're seeing crackdowns. What would you like to see as the next development in the step of the unfolding of this movement?
So I want to start with the last point that Professor Mottahedeh mentioned, and I absolutely agree with her that the major new point of this recent protest is life. I started with a style of life. So women, life, and freedom. This is the most prominent slogan of this protest. And also, they need to remove something. They do not have any other word for removing except this. So because of it, they use this. But I agree with you that this is the protest for finding the life, especially for the style of life. And ironically, so the movement of revolution in 1979 that was started in about 1963, it was because of the opposition of Shiite authority on that time against the right for women to vote. And now we understand this is in these protests, all those women, the next generation of them, their kids came to the street and they chanted the demands for finding the choice, their choice for a style of life. I agree that the future of Iran will be in the hand of the women and the free men, but by giving this right to the women, they have this right to choose how to dress, how to choose their style of life. But for the future, I think for the future of Iran, we have a new understanding of Islam. Many people on that time in 1979, most of the Iranians thought that we can find the best solution by following Khomeini. No, in this time, they reached, no, this is wrong, this was a wrong way. Religion is something for ethics, for morality, for connection between the people, their soul, and God, but not the best way for managing, for administration of the society or the country. I think this is the most important point that we can find among the Iranians. On that time, majority of Iranians voted to this type of administration, and no, majority of them are against this type of administration. It means they support secular administration, and this is the turning point. And because of it, I think this is my optimistic view about future of Iran: secular, democratic regime, and egalitarian, especially egalitarian, gender egalitarian, and also religious egalitarianism. All of them are accepted by majority of Iranians. And I'm sure if you compare Iran with other Middle Eastern countries, Iran is number one, will be number one in all of these demands, much more in, I think, better than the other countries, and we can see in the future.
Absolutely, thank you. And Professor Mottahedeh, as you so concisely put earlier, we don't know what's going to happen, but what's one or more concrete steps that you would like to see happen and might reasonably expect and hope to see happen in the short term?
I really can't answer that.
Well, that's perfectly understandable. If there's one thing we know about protest and revolution, these things are tremendously uncertain by their very nature. I think we will call it there. Thank you so much for everybody for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, Professors Negar Mottahedeh, Mohsen Kadivar, and Bruce Jensen, for sharing your invaluable scholarship and perspectives with us today. We're holding regular briefings on the challenges facing the world. If you'd like to be on the list for future briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu to let us know. In the meantime, please keep those in harm's way in Iran and everywhere else in the world in your thoughts. Thank you very much. Take care, and thank you for joining us. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you.